buddy. It's all yours.
Got him. What's up? Got him. Hit! Good trade!
Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and our previous review of the VFC AR system drew an unexpected number of commenters asking about the VFC M16A1. Today we're doing a quick video overview of the M16A1 just to share how it stacks up against the 733 and Mark 18 in terms of realism, build quality, and practicality, but if you're new to VFC ARs, we recommend checking out that video for more general info. The early history of the AR-15 development by Armalite is beyond the scope of this video, but the M16 was marked with controversy due to frequent malfunctions in combat in Vietnam. In 1967, the rifle was formally adopted as the M16A1, just changing the markings on what was by this point a mature rifle. New buffers, chrome chambers, standardized ammunition specifications, consistent manufacturer formalized maintenance procedures, and a whole host of minor tweaks had gradually ironed out the problems with the rifle, and in the closing years of the Vietnam War, the M16A1 acquitted itself well in combat. It was rapidly adopted by the rest of the US military and purchased by foreign governments as well, seeing combat use among Anzac troops in Vietnam and British SAS in the Falklands in 1982. The A1 was the standard US service rifle until its replacement with the M16A2 in the mid to late 1980s, but it continued in the hands of US reservists and National Guard long after. Despite its age, even today it's still in use by various militaries, irregulars, and police. It's a reliable, effective, downright revolutionary rifle whose successors are ubiquitous, and while the US has finally adopted a non-AR platform and new guns tend to borrow more from Stoner's later AR-18 design, the AR-15 isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Now, we don't have a real M16A1 to compare VFC's version against, but we do have a 1973 Colt SP1, the commercial market equivalent, so let's get into the externals. First and foremost, this VFC has been somewhat upgraded, so it reflects what the platform is capable of more than what it is out of the box. The entire outer barrel assembly, for example, is Vipertech and tracks pretty closely to the finish and design of the real thing. The original VFC parts, on the other hand, are nearly flat black and the same lightweight aluminum alloy that we saw on the 733. As with the 733, it is a 14mm negative threaded barrel, so it is compatible with airsoft muzzle devices, but not real ones. This muzzle device is a steel A1 flash hider, like the 733's, but it's secured with a lock ring. Like the 733, it uses a roll pin to secure the front sling swivel, despite this being inaccurate to the rivet used on the real A1. Unlike the 733, it does have a bayonet lug, and it is properly functional for when the other team isn't calling their hits. We got like 2 jokes. Let's look at the VFC furniture. For comparison, here's a set of surplus Vietnam-era furniture. You can see that it has this speckly fiberglass texture, and compared to that, the nearly flat black nylon of the VFC furniture with only a hint of texture and certain light is pretty lame. But the SP1 furniture, on the other hand, is pretty close to the VFC, although glossier, and the fiberglass is more visible in direct sunlight. And here's a set of modern production A1 furniture, which is indistinguishable from the VFC set. So this furniture is adequate for what it's trying to be, and replacement isn't worthwhile unless you get a surplus set. On the receiver, we have appropriate markings and serial number range, the expected A1 contours of the lower, and otherwise mostly the same details as the 733. The obnoxious non-tapered slip ring is correct for an A1, it has the appropriate teardrop forward assist, although note that this is non-functional, and the ejection port cover is the A1 style with angular internal housing and smaller external tab, plus a more appropriate color than the very light gray we saw on the 733. It does have an interesting receiver color though. You can see that it's more brown or purple than the bluish SP1 receivers, this flat gray Nodak Spud receiver, or this Norel's Moly Resin Colt grayish black lower receiver. Anodizing is an inconsistent process, and AR receivers can vary from green to gray to purple to blue to bronze, so this isn't an inaccurate finish, it's just unusually specific. It's also showing wear as is typical for VFCs, so if it ends up looking gross, we'll probably just refinish it in the aforementioned Moly Resin. Oh, and this is a Z-part steel bulk carrier rather than the original zinc, though we'll cover that more when we get to Aftermarket. That's, well, about all that's worth discussing, otherwise the broad strokes of the externals are the same as the 733. Unlike the 733, which has a number of historical inaccuracies and weird finishes, the only thing really wrong here is the use of a roll pin for the front sling swivel, and even that's a pretty mild departure from realism for the sake of practicality. Besides that, it's all accurate, even down to the tiny details. No right side selector tick, A1 ejection port cover, proper profile on the lower receiver, round front sight. Where the 733 represents a poorly documented commercial gun from a transitional era that VFC seems to have had difficulty pinning down, the M16A1 is more straightforward as a formally adopted military rifle, and this replica uses all appropriately A1 parts. And while out of the box it has the same use of alloy parts as the 733, the only area where this is really obvious is the barrel group. Swapping that out makes a huge difference both in appearance and handling, and is highly recommended. Internally, it's almost identical to the 733, there are just a few key differences in the recoil system relating to it being a full-size rifle. Unlike a real M16, it uses the same recoil spring as its carbine counterpart.
Are you sure about that?
But it does use a rifle-length buffer by default, which is longer and heavier than a carbine buffer, and the VFC version does not have shifting weights. As with the 733, we suggest replacing this with a real buffer, though in this case it's a 5.2 ounce or 150 gram rifle buffer, rather than the shorter 3 ounce or 85 gram carbine buffer. This buffer tube, or rather receiver extension tube if you want to get pedantic, is mil-spec and can be directly replaced with a real one, particularly since, unlike with the 733, this is actually the same length internally as the real thing. Rather than have a shorter internal channel like on the carbines, this gun uses an internal spacer to shorten the bulk carrier travel, which can be dropped into a mil-spec tube to get the right travel length. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with the VFC tube and no functional need to replace it, but it does use different screw threading from mil-spec, and in our case this made it incompatible with an aftermarket stock that required its own screw for attachment. The stock inner barrel is 360mm, a mere 14 inches, and uses the same hop unit and adjustment wheel system as the 733. It will accept up to a 510mm barrel with no problems. Increasing the inner barrel length may affect the power output though, and as with the 733 we had to shim the rocket valve to keep it consistent at 1.5 joules. However, there is another way. Here's an unmodified adjustable valve and its silver aligning bracket in the correct orientation within the nozzle. If I flip the valve and bracket upside down, it significantly reduces power output. This limits the adjustment range to a maximum of about 1.6 joules at room temperature, but it's quite stable and requires no modification to the parts. Also note that this can be done with other VFC ARs, so if you don't need over 1.5 joules or to account for cold weather, it is a viable alternative to shimming the valve. So for performance, this gun is pretty much the same as the guns we previously reviewed. It's a little less efficient due to the heavy buffer, but still more than capable of clearing mags even in freezing weather. At range, the stock barrel and hop setup is okay at best, with inconsistency in both axes as well as amount of hop applied. With a 510mm aftermarket barrel and 60-degree unicorn bucking, we see much better results, beating the W hold we recommended in the previous review. It still isn't quite perfect, with a bit of hop variance noticeable past 150 feet, but otherwise the accuracy is excellent, and we are hopeful that Guillotine Airsoft's upcoming drop-in hop arm replacement will close that final gap. That leads into Aftermarket, which I want to cover before we get into Practicality. Right off the bat, we highly recommend replacing the front end with a DNA, Crusader, or Vipertech equivalent. The original black finish is the most obviously wrong part of the gun, and the handling feels much less toy-like with a steel barrel and front sight base. Beyond that, a steel carrier is ideal for long-term use, as we covered in our 733 review, but not strictly necessary. This is a Z-parts carrier, and I wish we could recommend it unconditionally, but out of the box it was so rough it had to be honed on the inside with a 12-gauge bore brush to make it smooth enough to stop grabbing the nozzle when cycling, and it even had a bit of rust due to lack of oil. Crusader also makes a carrier, but it doesn't appear to have the provision for extra mass that the Z-parts one does. The default Z-Parts carrier is 225 grams assembled, pretty typical for a steel carrier, but then installing the optional weights boosts that to 300 grams, which with the 5.2 ounce or 150 gram buffer gives a whopping 450 grams of moving mass, the most of any gun we've reviewed. We've also swapped the magazine catch for a slightly shortened real one, although just buying a VFC steel catch would have been a lot less work, and realistically the stock magazine release is fine. We've also replaced the selector detent and spring with real ones to allow the use of real pistol grips, which is totally unnecessary if you want to stick with the stock grip. And we've replaced the rear takedown pin detent and spring, again with real ones, but with the spring cut a bit shorter so that we could tap the slot for a grub screw to retain it, which makes swapping the stock easier. This was all just to allow swapping back and forth with a wood furniture set, so if you plan to just leave your furniture in place, there's no need to mess with the detents or springs. With just a few choice upgrades, this is an accurate, hard recoiling, snappy, efficient rifle. It isn't the loudest or the most impressive sounding, likely due in part to that plastic chamber, but it is fun to shoot, usable in all weather conditions, and just as effective in raw performance as the other VFC ARs we previously reviewed. As far as practicality, it seems my offhand joke about retro ARs being obsolete didn't go over well with at least one commenter. I'm not sure why some gun guys think airsofters can't also be gun guys too, but it's almost poetic when the dude trying to talk down to us is a War Thunder player, video game collector, and furry role player who named his 1911s after My Little Pony. Nice OC. More importantly, if you've seen our prior videos, you've probably deduced that I poke fun at retro ARs because I own both real and airsoft ones, and I like them a lot despite their limitations. So let me crack open a can of boomer juice and explain why you, dear viewer, need an obsolete musket too. This is one of the worst things I've ever tasted. Now, if you're genuinely interested in retro ARs, the VFC M16A1 is your personal ticket to understanding the vision of Eugene Stoner and Jim Sullivan. With a full steel front set, it still only weighs 7¼ pounds or 3.3 kilograms loaded with a 30-round mag and handles just like its real counterpart. It's a lightweight, slim, handy rifle that points easily, with the pencil barrel profile and plastic handguards minimizing weight at the front so that it balances over the magazine well and can be held shouldered with minimal fatigue. Sure, it's long, but the lightweight, great balance, and relatively short length of pull combine to make it feel smaller than it is. Even in CQB, this is a manageable setup so long as you short stock and take corners appropriately, and the long handguards facilitate a modern extended grip for great muzzle control. The long sight radius gives better precision than shorter carbines, plus you can replace the front sight with a luminous equivalent or just paint it for better visibility, and enlarge the rear aperture for easier acquisition at short range. With these tweaks to the excellent AR sight design and this rifle's long sight radius, you get one of the best iron sight setups ever found on a fighting rifle. And the controls are exactly the same as modern ARs, with the same easy mag changes and ergonomic bolt release and safety. If your only experience with 20-inch ARs is with one of the A1's longer, front-heavy successors, this is a whole different ballgame. Now, despite my praise, I don't mean to imply that the M16A1 is just as good as modern ARs. Modern optics are still more effective than any iron setup, collapsible stocks provide adjustable length of pull to accommodate body armor and storage, free float rails improve accuracy and consistency by avoiding pressure on the barrel, and the modularity afforded by M-Lock is unmatched. Yeah, it turns out 60 years of iteration have improved a few things, who'd have guessed. But I've never handed the SP1 off to a shooter accustomed to modern ARs and had them come back saying they didn't like it. The early ARs got some things so right that the difference in practical effectiveness is not nearly as big as a lot of people assume, and these rifles demonstrate how some of the changes made to the AR platform represent trade-offs rather than straight upgrades. Now for Airsoft, you may not get the soft recoil of a rifle-length gas and buffer system or the ballistic benefits of a 20-inch barrel, though you also won't have to deal with keyholing with heavy ammo or point-of-impact shift with heat buildup. But either way, it's still a clean, simple, holistically designed rifle that handles better than many carbines half its size and gets the job done. While you do need solid fundamentals to be effective with irons, if you can do your part, this rifle still holds its own.
Got one?
Now, most guys looking to get a retro AR choose not to stray too far out of their comfort zone and build a 90s carbine with an optic and barrel-mounted flashlight. I like those setups a lot, and this sort of build can accomplish most of the capability of a modern carbine while staying stylish. But there are no surprises here, it's just a less modular M4 with a built-in riser. What makes the M16A1 interesting is that it's so different from modern carbines, and yet still a far cry from the big, clunky battle rifles it resembles at first glance. It's such an elegant design that some aspects of it still compare favorably against guns half a century newer, and it's without a doubt the most approachable and modern feeling of the Cold War rifles. For those reasons, I think anyone interested in the history of the AR, or just retro rifles in general, should give it a try, even if you have to settle for an Airsoft version. Okay, rounds complete, now let's talk gear. First, unless you have a specific kit in mind that requires them, we suggest you skip the 20-round mags. While the A1 is often associated with 20-round mags due to their prominent use in Vietnam, the 30-round mags were issued as early as 1970 and became the default by the mid-1970s, so for the overwhelming majority of the M16A1's service life, it was primarily issued with 30-round mags. For the VFC, both mags are the same price, so a combat load of 30s is a lot cheaper, and as we mentioned in the previous video, there isn't any really good load-bearing equipment for 20-round mags, in part because everyone jumped to 30s as soon as possible. With 30s, you can have your choice of any modern LBE, but if you want to stick to a retro theme, there are some decent options. In particular, the Alice system contains my personal favorite retro mag pouch. It's bulky, but with a bit of practice, the buckle is faster than Velcro. More importantly, the stiffened top means it can actually be left unbuckled without losing mags, and this makes for a very quick reload even by the standards of modern gear. Unfortunately, full Alice setups aren't as cheap as they used to be, and the flimsy belt and effectively 3-point yoke make it pretty bad at stabilizing heavy loads. If you do go with Alice, try to keep it to just your essential fighting gear and ensure it's balanced front to back and side to side. I suggest you start with 2 canteens in the back and 2 mag pouches up front, and then you can add a dump pouch, gas storage, holster, or extra mag pouches as needed. If you need sustainment, resist the temptation to add the very cool but very floppy Alice butt pack, which wasn't issued outside of training, and for good reason, but that's beyond the scope of this video, and instead add a ruck or backpack. Ultimately, I think the best upgrade you can make to Alice is to replace the Y harness with a better suspension setup like the LBV88 vest, which provides better shoulder straps, extra pouches, and many more points of contact for the belt to help stabilize it. Alternatively, another viable approach is of course some flavor of chest rig. The South African pattern 83 works well, but it requires a spacer in the bottom of each cell for optimal height. A bald sock works, but a chunk of 1-inch foam insulation is even better and won't absorb water. I can't really recommend the P83 though, as the prices they command nowadays are pretty excessive. There are cheaper alternatives out there, the most prominent of which is probably the venerable chest rig often called a Chi-Com. Back to the rifle, if you don't like the profile of the triangular handguard, A2 handguards are drop-in and their shape is more similar to carbine handguards. When M16A2 production started, Colt discontinued manufacture of the A1 handguards, so this was actually a common alteration for old A1s that needed replacement handguards due to breakage, and you still see A1s with A2 handguards in the hands of irregulars and reserves nowadays. The M16A1 can of course accommodate grenade launchers, both the XM148 and M203, and if you're interested in how they compare, check out our review of the VFC XM148. If you do opt for an M203 with its heat shield though, be sure to get one that uses a yoke to attach to the barrel rather than the later Knight's quick detach system, which will not fit under the heat shield. We recommend the G&P M203, but availability is spotty, so it may take some hunting to find one. With the grenade launcher mounted, the use of a roll pin on the front sling swivel does make it easy to remove. And as with other retro ARs, you can mount optics to the carry handle, though the same caveats apply as with the 733. There aren't many historical references for non-magnified optics being used on A1s, with the most prominent example we can find being Navy SEAL VBSS teams in the 90s using A1s with 8.5000s for snipers. But Colt did produce 3x and 4x scopes, and these saw combat use in Vietnam and thereafter. These allow the use of irons underneath the scope, and are fairly practical even for the short ranges of Airsoft, but modern real steel repros are in the $300 to $400 range, and cheaper clones vary considerably in quality. And in any case, I tend to feel that unless you're using the irons, you're squandering one of the few advantages of using a 20-inch rifle for Airsoft. Lastly, slings. As with the 733, the default sling attachment goes on the underside of the gun for carry, so if you want a tactical sling you need to do a little bit of work. Making a top sling attachment at the front is the same as in the 733 video, but obviously attaching a sling to the top of a fixed stock is a bit different. Take about 2 feet of paracord, bring the ends together, and pull it through itself to tie a knot with a loop at least 2 inches tall. Now place this knot on top of the stock, aligned over the swivel on the bottom. Wrap the paracord around the stock, going in opposite directions, keeping it just behind the swivel. Loop the left side over the right, and then the right side over the left, and carefully pull tight. Cut off any excess, and you're done. Looks complicated, but ultimately pretty simple. The US military nylon slings are a little short for this purpose, but retro-style slings are readily available, or can be made easily from nylon webbing and tri-glide buckles. Finally, conclusions and pricing. Rather than go point by point, I'll just say review the pros and cons for the VFC M733 and add on a few differences. This time it's much more historically accurate and has fewer weird finishes, with just the barrel group that's worth replacing. The only real negative compared to the other VFCs is just that this is a full-size fixed stock rifle, so your mileage may vary as far as practicality. As for whether it's worth it, well, at $550 to $600 USD shipped, it's almost as expensive as the deluxe ARs like the Mark 18, despite having all the same alloy parts as the budget 733. That is the price you pay for a full-size retro rifle, unfortunately, and adding a better inner barrel setup plus adjustable valve brings us up to $600 to $650. Throw in a steel front end and steel carrier and you're already up to $800 to $900 before even looking at magazines. That's no small chunk of change, but the only cheaper option for a gas M16 is WE, and that comes with its own set of problems that I feel make the VFC still the better choice. If cost is a concern, just starting with the gun plus replacement inner barrel and adjustable valve will achieve peak performance, and all the fancy steel bits for appearance and longevity can come later. Even with the gun fully blinged out, it'll still be less than a DNA, though without the CNC'd receivers. Overall, while I was initially disappointed with the appearance and feel, swapping the barrel group was sufficient to appease my unreasonable standards, and now I quite like this rifle. It's not up to the same build quality as my Vipertech setup, but it functions comparably well and with much less fuss getting to that point. It's a skirmishable piece with no unfixable weaknesses, and has broad applicability to different historical kits and eras. That's all for today, so if you want to support our channel, consider checking out our merch store in the description, and let us know in the comments if you'd like more content on either retro AR history or retro gear setups. We honestly don't know how much demand there is for that sort of thing. And as always, thanks for watching.
Hey, wait, what's wrong with playing War Thunder?
I said what I said.